In this lesson, we're going to take a look at adding sources to our project. And as we mentioned, sources in the context of DBT are ways to describe and name raw, unformatted data tables. So that's source data from your ELT tools. And if we take a look at the documentation for sources on the DBT website, we can see it's calling it the same thing. We're saying it's the data loaded into your extract and load tools. And as we mentioned, for our sake, we are focused on this data here, the Avengers, Fandango. We're going to call these our source data. So we want to create the equivalent pointers to these tables within our project. And going back to the documentation, what these will be are YAML files, and they're going to look like this. Every single one of them is going to start with version 2. I don't have a good explanation of why that is. It's something that's there by default, and we just have to put it there. And within the YAML files, we need to indicate that it's a source. And we do that by saying sources, and then the rest is YAML. We have a bunch of attributes. So we give a name and then the table information amongst other stuff. So what we'll do is, rather than just looking at this here, let's go into our project and add our own and work through it. Okay, so here we are in our project. I'm going to actually delete this folder. So let's go ahead and delete this because we'll work with something else. And we're going to start from scratch. So we have nothing in our models directory. Introduce some naming conventions of what I believe is a good way to do it. There's a lot of ways that different companies do this. But when it comes to this, a lot of times it's helpful to be explicit. So what we'll do here is we'll start and we're going to say SRC for source underscore, and then we'll give the name of the source that we're looking at here. So I'll say Fandango dot YAML because it's a YAML file. So we have a blank YAML file. We're saying SRC for source underscore, and then Fandango is the name of the schema in this case. So we'll do that. Keep it that way. And as I mentioned, naming convention is really important here. So as we move along, I'm going to start kind of pointing that out more. But I think prefixing all these with SRC is a good way to go. Okay, so as we have here, we're going to start with version 2. We need to say sources because we want DBT when it compiles is going to look through all of your files and see, okay, 1, where are the YAML files? And 2, which ones say sources as at the top? And that's how it's going to know it's an actual source, and use that source Jinja. That's how it figures it out. And then within this, we can give a name to the source. So we'll call the name of this source Fandango. We'll just call it Fandango. As we'll see in a minute, that's how you refer to it. You can have many different sources and give different names to different sources. You can do this all in one file. You can have one file for every single source in your project if you wanted. But as we mentioned, directories are really important. So you'll often have a source file for either all of the sources in a directory or in a schema, let's say, or one source per table that's acceptable. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about any YAML file that has this. You can have 1, you can have 100, whatever makes the most sense for you and your architecture. In our case, we're going to do one source file per schema. So we'll have ultimately 2. We'll have one for Fandango for these 2 tables, and then a different file for Avengers for this one. Now, in this example, they go right to tables, but there's a few other attributes that we can define here that I'm going to hop over to source properties. And we can see here, we can do all sorts of things. We can describe it with it. We can put a description. We can do a database schema. And what I think is really helpful is to be explicit about the database and the schema, because later on we'll see sometimes, if we want to declare when something's coming from the raw production or the raw dev, we want to be able to differentiate that. And there's some interesting ways we can do it. But for now, what we'll do under this, we have name, and then we have, let's put database. And for now, we will do raw dev. Next, we'll do schema, Fandango. And now let's go into those tables. So now, I know we're moving a little quick, but now we're going to go into the tables and do it similar to this. So it will be another list. The name of the first table will be Fandango score comparison. And the second is Fandango scrape. So ultimately what we're doing here, again, we're creating some pointers, as I like to think about it, to this source data in our project so that DBT, whenever we use that source Jinja function, it's going to know how to use this. And ultimately, that's it for how you would add a basic source to your project. But you might be wondering, what do we do with this now? And it kind of blends in a little bit to our next lesson, which is going to be on creating models. But just to give a quick sneak peek, just to show you what this looks like, let's create a new file and we'll call this test.sql. I just want to show you an example. We're not going to keep this long term. It's for learning. And again, the SQL files are going to be for creating models. So the models are what's going to be deployed. We're not going to deploy yet. Ultimately, we want to select from a source. And if we remember, the Jinja function for source is this from the previous lesson. Let's copy this in here. Here, we can open this up here. There will be two things here. So here, let's actually just copy this directly. In this case, we're just selecting all from using the source Jinja. We need to give a source name, and a trick here, Control or Command B hides that, Command B. And the way this works now is source name will be this name. So the name of the source, this is why anywhere you see sources, it'll know to pull from this. So we'll do Fandango, it's the name of the source, and one of the tables. So we'll just do the first one. And one thing is these should be in strings. So don't forget to add those. Now let's save this. And right now, obviously this doesn't mean anything. So what we're going to do, I'm going to introduce another command here to us, another DBT command, and that is DBT compile. So let's run this. And what this will do is look through your project, compile everything and build it out for you. Don't worry too much about this. It's because we deleted that example directory. But if we look now, we have this target directory, and we'll touch on this more later, but I want to show you what happens. Ultimately, what happens with Jinja in this case, and really what happens with Jinja, and in particular with source, it's now replaced the name of this, the name of this source and this table. It's found that from here and replaced it with this information. So now this is something that we can use. You know, it takes it from that to this, and this is going to give us some values now because it's pulling from that table. So ultimately, that's how sources work in DBT. This is a very simple example, but you can build on this as much as you want. You can add a bunch of tables, add descriptions, whatever you want. But that is a very fundamental concept that we'll use continuously here. We're going to pull from sources as much as we want. So to finish us off here, let's add another source for the other one. Let's add it for Avengers. We'll add this guy here. We'll go through the same process, and eventually we're going to organize this better, but we'll do a new file and we'll say source_avengers.yaml, because again, we're doing source to recognize that it's a source file, underscore Avengers to identify the schema. It's a good practice to keep things here aligned with what you have here. It just makes it easier. And we can essentially copy and paste this here. Let's do this, but instead of Fandango, it'll be Avengers. We only have one table called Avengers history. Save that. We can delete this model here. So we are ready to now build on top of this and start building transformations on top of this by creating models, which will be the next lesson, which is finally starting to create some transformation logic and creating transform data. And we'll start with what's called the staging layer, the staging directory, and we'll start to build out this model. So I'll see you at the next lesson.